I'm not sure how Carrie Ann knew I was going to start with a barbecue story this morning. Um, Other than it's probably pretty good odds most Sundays that there's going to be a barbecue story in it, especially if we're doing a series on food. Um, but we were putting this together, and I was looking at today and what we wanted to talk about today. I was reminded of this past summer. So, this past summer in late June, a friend called me up and invited me to their 4th of July party. And I hadn't really been doing a lot of social things at that point yet. And I thought this might be a nice way to do that. It was a lot of people, some of which I knew, a lot of which I didn't. And so when she called to ask if I would do this, I was like, if I wanted to come and I could bring my kids, and I said, I think so. That sounds like fun, I think. But by the way, can I bring anything? Who's doing the barbecuing? And as it happens, there was a plan in place that sort of fell apart last minute for her. So she was a bit scrambling to figure out what it is that she was going to do to provide the things one expects to have at a barbecue. To which I replied, tell me more. And she's like, well, and kind of explained what was going on. I said, well, can I bring something? And she's like, what would you like to bring? And I said, how much can I bring? And she's like, no, we just want you to come. We want you to enjoy and spend some time and all that. We know you've had a lot going on. To which I replied, yes, but I need a project. I need something I can do with myself. I need something that's going to keep me busy that I don't really have to think about, because that's where I was at the time. And so I said, would it be okay with you if I just took care of the meat? Would that be all right? And she's like, okay. Which of course immediately spent my gears turning of all the different ways that I could, because it actually at that point been several months since I'd had an opportunity to cook for any group of people. And I found myself rather excited about it, as you might guess. So I went to, the place that you go to, Costco, and kind of cruised around the meat section until I found a couple of things that looked good. And I thought, well, you got to have a beef option, you got to have a pork option, because of course you do. And so I found all of that, put it in the cart, took that home. And then I'm texting with my friend. I'm like, oh, by the way, do you have any like gluten-free or anything like that coming? And she's like, well, yeah, I think we do have a couple. I was like, okay, I might bring some side dishes too, if that's okay. And obviously the meat's gluten-free, but I will add in a couple extra, make sure I have a gluten-free side dish. She's like, you don't really need to do that. And I'm like, I know, but again, I need a project. So if it's okay with you, that's what I'm going to do. She's like, okay. And then a couple of days later, as I'm writing the menu out, I realize that there do exist in this world this thing called vegetarians. I don't really understand them, but I know they exist. And I thought, well, maybe there actually are going to be some vegetarians as well. And I do have this tendency, as one of my actual vegetarian friends will tell you, to sneak meat and meat products into things you otherwise wouldn't think would have meat and meat products in them. So I thought, well, I better ask her. So I texted her, like, do you have any vegetarians coming? And she's like, yes, I think we have a couple. She's like, but you don't really need to worry about it. And I'm like, well, too bad. And I'm like, okay. And so by the time we're done, my smoker is loaded up with all kinds of crazy stuff in it, and there is way too much food coming for what it is. I have no idea how many people are going to be there, or any idea how many people I'm feeding. I didn't even think to ask those questions. But on one hand, I really did need a project, and two, there's just something about preparing food for other people. There is just something about the act of spending your time and your energy to prepare food that will not only be enjoyed by you, but be enjoyed by all of those who are around you. It is a great way to introduce yourself to new people if your food is good. Mine's okay. But it's a great way to introduce yourself to new people, and it's a great way to create space. There's something about bringing food for people to share that is able to create a community experience in a way that almost nothing else can do, right? Which is why we do it at things like 4th of July barbecues and for dinners and birthday parties and all that sort of stuff. There's something about bringing people around table that creates a space and a time for people to gather and have good times together and talk with one another and fellowship with one another, right? It's one of the reasons why we always try to have the snack time after the church. I know why you're here, right? Especially if you're here in person, this is great, but it's the snack time afterwards that I know, like where you hear a lot of the laughing and the excitement and all that kind of stuff, because there's something about gathering around table. Now, this is not today any different than it was in the early church. And in fact, the earliest forms of worship the church had was gathering around table, right? People gathering together to share a meal. And people would bring what they had bring whatever they had to that meal, and sometimes they would share with one another. And in the beginning, this worked out great. And eventually, though, some problems started to crop up. And so there's several early church letters that we have in the New Testament where authors are addressing some of the problems that cropped up. And so this is Paul in today's letter addressing the church in Rome, addressing some of the problems that cropped up around their table and trying to offer a correction to them. Now, one of the biggest problems that Paul is facing in the church in Rome is there's basically two dominant groups. There are Christians that come from a Jewish background, and there are Christians who come from a Gentile background that basically means everything that's not Jewish. And both of those traditions bring something with them. And one of the things that both those traditions bring with them is a lot of customs around food. And a lot of these are customs that people grew up with really from birth. And if you come from like the Jewish side of things, you grew up with this list of food that you eat and food that you don't. Right? And it was fairly direct and it was fairly succinct, and everybody knew that you do eat this and you don't eat that. And that's how most of these people, if not all of the Jewish Christians in the early part of the church, grew up knowing that we eat this and we don't eat that. And so you can imagine it's sometimes a problem for them when they see other people eating the food or eating the kind of animal that they've been told their whole lives they're not supposed to eat. Now, on the Gentile side, they didn't have as many hang-ups about what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. But in most Roman homes, one of the things that you would do is that you would take some part of what you were going to eat, and you would take it to the altar you would have at home. So if you can imagine like having a little home altar, usually somewhere in like the main living space, and it would have little statues of the gods that were most important to you. And the Romans had a lot of gods. There were plenty to choose from. But usually you had a couple that were kind of the gods of your household. And you would come, and part of what you would do when you would eat is you would take part of the food, and then you would put it on the altar for the god to have. Now, being fairly pragmatic people, you wouldn't actually leave the food there forever. In fact, you would put it up there for a while, assume whatever god it was took whatever they wanted, and then you would come take the food back down and eat it because, we don't waste food, right? I mean, even today, it was a value 2,000 years ago when food was actually far more valuable and far more expensive than it is today. So when the Bible talks about food sacrificed to idols, that's what they mean. Right? What it means is that somebody may have prepared some food at home, left it on their family altar for whatever their gods were, and then took it from there to whatever communal gathering they were at. So on one hand, so you can see where the Jews are going to struggle with this because they know they are also not supposed to eat food sacrificed to idols. Right? And then, of course, on the Roman side, they're trying to ask themselves, what's the big deal? None of this really, what does it matter what kind of animal it was? What does it matter what does it matter? Right? And so you have these two very different groups of people with these two very different backgrounds, with these two very different understandings about food and what's clean and unclean and how it's supposed to work and how it's not supposed to work. And here they are trying to be together, trying to create this new thing together, trying to be at table together, and trying to figure out how it is that they are going to become this new thing together. So Paul writes into that situation, and it's very interesting what he chooses to say. He doesn't give them a black and white solution. He doesn't say, well, this group just needs to get over it, this group is right, or this group needs to do this differently in order to accommodate that group. He doesn't say anything like that. What he says instead is that you need to think about what it is that you are really trying to do. What are you really trying to do together? When you gather together around table, when those early Christians gather together around table, what is it they are actually trying to accomplish? Are they trying to accomplish a dinner party? Are they trying to accomplish some sort of contest to decide who's right and who's wrong? Is it a confrontational thing? Is it a community thing? What is going on? And Paul reminds them what is going on is you are gathering together to worship God. And you shouldn't bring anything into that space that's going to get in the way of you worshiping God. And oh, by the way, you shouldn't bring anything into that space that's going to get in the way of your brother or your sister or your neighbor or your cousin or whoever else that happens to be there, who's going to get in their way of worshiping God as well. And then we get this great language around stumbling blocks. Now, we think about stumbling blocks as metaphorical things, but in the time that we were talking about 2,000 years ago, they were actually very, very real things because if you were lucky enough to have a paved road, it was a cobblestone paved road or a stone paved road, some of which still exist today because they were just built that well. But what you had was basically individual paved stones. And every once in a while, because, there's like things like, for those of us who live out in this part of the world are aware of things called like frost heaves, which don't really happen much in Italy, as so I'm told, and, in the Mediterranean in general. But things do shift and things do change, and it's not uncommon for one of these one of the stones to kind of pop up a little bit, and it becomes what is quite literally a stumbling block, right? You're walking down the street, you don't realize that the stone has popped up a little bit, and maybe you stumble your toe on it or whatever. So when Paul uses this language of stumbling block, right, everybody immediately knows what he's talking about and can immediately think of the last time they accidentally stubbed their sandaled big toe on one of these stumbling blocks and the curse words they probably uttered. Because people 2,000 years ago aren't much different than us today. So you can honestly think about it as, the way I always thought about this is you think about in your neighborhood, that one piece of like cracked cement that you know about that's just down the street, right? So when you're out walking the dog, you know to avoid that cracked piece of cement, right? Otherwise, or the first time you run into it, right? Especially when you're a kid on the bike, when you don't know that there's a big hole in the cement, it becomes more of a stumbling block or more of a fall on your face block. So Paul says, don't intentionally put these blocks in front of other people. Be conscious of what it is that you're doing. Remember what it is that you're doing. You're there to worship God, not to get into a contest of who knows the right thing to eat and the wrong thing to eat. That's why for me, whenever it is we do have people over, I do have the opportunity to host people for food, or I do have an opportunity like I had last July to bring food to people, I do like to ask the question, are there any vegetarians? Are there any gluten-free? Any of the common stuff? Any nut allergies or anything like that? Why? Because the point of gathering is to gather together, to have a good time together, and for everybody to feel as included as they can. When I am hosting people or I'm blessed to go somewhere or be around people, and I'm sure many of you are the same, you want people to gather, not to just say, oh my gosh, look at this amazing food you made. Oh, that's nice. You want them to gather together and feel like they're being cared for and appreciated, that their coming has been anticipated and prepared for. You want them to feel the love eating, the same amount of love that you put into making it. And one of the best ways we can do that is ask the question, is there anybody who can't have what I'm making? Is there anything I can do to better prepare for those who have different needs than I have needs? And can I do it in such a way where I'm not judging them, even though every once in a while, vegetarians, I swear. No, they're fine, you're fine. But that is the point. Because the point isn't actually to show off the food. The point isn't, it's not a barbecue contest, right? The point isn't to win. The point is to make sure that people can gather and they can eat and they can have fun and they can share stories and they can celebrate. And we can only do that when everybody can participate. And that's what Paul wants for the early church. He wants everyone to be able to participate. He doesn't want any boundaries for anybody to come to the table and experience God's grace and love. Because what he also knows is everybody at that table is new. The church is new. It's brand new. Not everybody knows all the expectations. Not everybody has learned everything yet. So we work hard, and he wants people to work hard and try hard to make sure there are no more barriers than absolutely necessary for people to come and learn the good news. It's really important to know what you're actually trying to do. And not great things happen when either we forget what it is that we're actually trying to do, or we don't understand what the other people are trying to accomplish. Now, the other thing, as much as I do love barbecue, and I do love barbecue, the other thing that I really enjoy is cars. If you've been around here any long time, you know that I do really love cars. When a couple of years ago they're like, "Can we have a car show at the church?" I'm like, "Yeah, we can definitely do that." I would love nothing more than to ogle some cars. And if you don't know anything about cars, that's fine, but there's probably a few things you have heard of, and actually some few brands that you no doubt have heard of. And most of you can no doubt identify this one on the screen, right? What kind of car is this? This is Ferrari, right. And even if you don't know it by sight, my guess is I don't know if there's a person alive who probably hasn't heard the name Ferrari and probably doesn't think of them as a very high cost, prestigious vehicle, because that's how they've always kind of been portrayed and how they continue to be portrayed today. Ferrari does not make any cheap cars, right? They only make expensive cars, and they only make fast cars. It's what they've always done. And today we can even use, and people think of Ferrari today, they think of it as really kind of the upper echelon of cars. So it might be surprising for some of us to learn when Ferrari first started making cars to go on the road that you and I could drive, though we couldn't afford them today. And if you can, we should talk after church. But when they started to make cars for the road, people assumed they were going to be these amazing cars, right? That were the pinnacle of anything a car could be. That's how they were marketed. That's how they were sold to us, right? And so, of course, if you could afford it, you wanted to have, when they first started coming out in the 40s and the 50s, a Ferrari in your garage. And in fact, today, especially 1950s Ferraris, can go for today multiple millions of dollars. Which is really interesting because those early Ferraris were a lot of things, and one of the things they was actually pretty bad cars, right? As you and I understand cars and the purpose of a car and what it is supposed to do, even a sports car, which you expect some compromises around, right? You know it's not going to have the best trunk space and those kinds of things. Early Ferraris were actually really bad cars, leading to fun articles like this one I found. This is from 1966 from Road Test magazine. And it's called The Great Ferrari Hoax. And what it basically goes through is it goes through and takes Ferrari to task, because their job is to actually do road tests. And they actually takes Ferrari to task for actually building rather poor quality automobiles. They weren't built particularly well. They did not drive particularly well. Yes, they had a big engine in them, and yes, they could go fast. They didn't turn particularly well. They didn't stay together all that well, right? And for the cost and the price, they were actually what the author and the editors of the magazines thought were actually a bit of a scam, right? And so they spend this whole 4-page article, and it's really funny. You can read it. There's some great one-liners in it where they just do not care about. But of course, this is also Americans making fun of Italians, so we're pretty good at that. And they take it to task over and over and over and over again. And only about midway through the article do they let on of the fact that they actually know what the problem is. And the problem is, as they understand it, and as we today know, and as even anybody paying attention at the time would know, is that anybody buying a Ferrari car in the 1950s assumed Ferrari was in the car manufacturing business, right? Because they manufactured cars. They assumed they were in the car manufacturing business, and thus they wanted to build a quality car and sell a quality car. Well, as it happens, Enzo Ferrari, the founder of Ferrari, who was still very much in charge at the time, did not understand himself to be in the car manufacturing business. Enzo thought of himself to be in the racing business. Enzo was in the business of winning races. That's what he cared about. Winning races, if you don't know, is expensive. So one of the ways you can pay to win races is to convince people to buy your rather crud cars. And that is what Ferrari did. So they would take only mildly modified race cars that have really honestly no business driving on the roads of today because they're not designed for that. They would take mildly modified race cars and then try to sell them to, rich people, convincing them that this was the best thing they could possibly own. And oh, by the way, if it's hard to drive, that's your fault, not ours. And they persisted with this really throughout the up through all the way through the 1950s and the 1960s until they got bought by an actual automobile manufacturer that actually wanted to manufacture actual automobiles. And then Ferrari got better. As I've heard today, they're actually not so bad. I wouldn't know. If you have one, I'd love a ride. And then we'll have a conversation later. And even today, we might even know, but even today, we may assume that Ferrari is in the business of selling cars. Well, actually, kind of, but not really. Ferrari actually makes half of their money selling merchandise and hats and jackets and all those sorts of things. Ferrari is actually more of a brand like Louis Vuitton than it is anything else. Now, it's not to say their cars are bad, but they also know what business they're in. And if you're going to buy one, you probably want to know what business they're in. If you bought a Ferrari in the 50s and 60s, you were in the business of supporting Enzo Ferrari going racing, which means you probably weren't getting a very good car because he didn't really care about the car that you were getting. He cared about whether he was winning races. What we care about, our intentions, why we are doing the thing that we are doing matters. And in fact, Paul is here to remind us that it matters more than anything else. And he has a couple of interesting lines in the scripture to remind us of it. He so clearly does not want to draw a black and white line. He does not want to say this is right and this is wrong. To the point at the end, part of this he says, but those who have doubts are condemned if they eat. Which means that if you think that eating food sacrificed to idols is wrong, if you think that eating eating a pig versus eating a cow is not okay, and you do it anyway, that's a problem. Even though Paul himself knows it's not actually a problem for God. What we believe matters. How we act on what we believe matters. And so we have to ask ourselves, whenever we do anything, what is our actual goal here? Is our goal to love God, to really love our neighbor, and to love ourselves? And if that is the goal, then shouldn't we at least ask the question, will there be any vegetarians around? If our goal is to love God and to help others around us love God, then obviously we shouldn't put any barriers up that we don't need to or have to, or really at all, to help people understand what God's love and grace truly looks like. If our goal is to love ourselves, then we probably need to learn to let ourselves off the hook and give ourselves a little bit of grace, because we will inevitably mess up. It will happen. So loving God, loving neighbor, and loving self is what the church is about. It's what it's been about 2,000 years ago. It's what it's about today. Paul wanted people to know and wanted people to understand that the church is not the church if we are excluding people for trivial reasons. And what we eat and how we eat is a trivial reason. The church is not the church if we are putting stumbling blocks in front of people to help learn more about grace and peace and love. As I've said multiple times, if you want to watch me lose my absolute mind, ask somebody to get out of your pew. I'm just telling you, that's not going to go well for you. No. Obviously, we want people to come and be comfortable in any way that they can, and we want people to feel like this is a place that is open to all people, because it is. That's what Paul is telling us 2,000 years ago, and that's what we are to remember today. At the end of the day, what business we are in. We are in the loving God, loving neighbor, and loving self business. We are in the business of helping people understand that. If something helps us do that, great. We should do as much of it as we can. If something gets in the way of us doing that, then we should stop doing it immediately. We know what business we are in. Not everybody else around us does. Most people don't actually know what the church is or what it's for. So it's really important that we do. So Paul, all those years ago, reminds us how to do it. Amen.